everyone, welcome to the April 23rd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and I will be flying solo today as my usual co-host, Craig Wolkowski, not available. You might have seen some pictures on Twitter that he had a bit of a disaster with his ceiling, so I know he's getting some work done at his house today, so recording a podcast not exactly an option. So Craig will definitely be back next week when we record the TimeformUS Pacecast, and I was recently informed next week's Pacecast will actually be our 100th episode of that Tuesday podcast. So look forward to that, as we're likely to discuss the Kentucky Derby contenders on next week's show in the lead up to the first Saturday in May, which I really can't believe is coming up the weekend after this one. But the focus on this TimeformUS Forecast is this weekend's racing. I'm going to hop around the country a little bit and discuss 5 stakes races at 4 different venues. We'll begin at Pimlico, which is just opening up their spring meet. They're running a bunch of stakes races on the Saturday card. I'm going to discuss the Frank Whiteley for older dirt sprinters and the Federico Tessio going 2 turns on the main track for the 3-year-olds. They'll move on to Santa Anita, where they're running the Crystal Water as the first race. That's a mile on the turf for California breds. At my local track, Belmont Park, the weekend opener is the Elusive Quality, going 7 furlongs on the turf. A pretty well-matched field there, with Chad Brown having many contenders. And then we'll wrap things up at Churchill Downs as they open up their spring meet ahead of the Kentucky Derby next week. The William Walker is the feature race on their Saturday evening card. We'll see if that one stays on the turf. I know that there's some rain in the forecast for Kentucky on Saturday, but we'll handicap it as if it's a turf race. So let's kick things off on this podcast with those 2 races from Pimlico on Saturday. Beginning with race 7 on that stakes-laden card, it is the Frank Whiteley going 6 furlongs on the main track, and you're likely to have a significant favorite in this race in the number 5, Where She Told Me to Go, for the Brittany Russell barn. Brittany Russell's been winning at a high percentage for the past basically year on the Maryland circuit, and this horse is clearly coming into this race with some of the top form. He's seeking his 5th consecutive victory, having crossed the line in 5 consecutive races. He was disqualified out of the first victory for Brittany Russell, but the last 3 have all been wins that he's earned. Now he's looking for that 4th stakes win in a row here, and if he runs back to the speed figures that he earned 2 and 3 back when he took the 2020 version of the Frank Whiteley back in November and the Dave's Friend in December, he's going to be tough in this race. But you have to wonder if he can run back to those speed figures, given that his return from the layoff last time back in early March, it was a workmanlike victory where he got the job done by just over 2 lengths as the 1-5 favorite. That TimeformUS speed figure of just 108, not quite up to what's likely to be required to win this race. He's also a horse that does do his best running from off the pace, so he's a little bit reliant on how quickly they go up front. But he's certainly a contender in this race, and arguably the horse to beat. I think there are some other contenders, though, that are worthy of a look and figure to be better prices, given that this one is going to attract so much money. So I'm using Where She Told Me to Go, but I think there are other horses that you can take a look at. The one that I'm most interested in as the alternative to this horse is the number 9, Eastern Bay. Watching this horse's last race in the Frank Whiteley, same name as this, but different time of the year, back in last November, he was beaten over 11 lengths by Where She Told Me to Go, finishing last of 10 that day. But this horse just had the kind of trip that gave him no chance. He broke from the outside post in a 10-horse field, was extremely wide all the way around the far turn. His rider just basically gave up on him at the top of the stretch, and he was just never competitive after losing all that ground. Something also might have gone wrong in that race, because he missed a lot of time after that the entire winter season at Laurel, and now he's coming back at Pimlico for his 7-year-old debut. If he can get back to the races that he was running prior to that Frank Whiteley, I think he's a major player here. He ran really well over this course and distance in the DeFrancis Dash at the beginning of October on that Preakness Day card, closing to just missed by a nose to today's rival Lockheed. And I think if he can get back into that form for Claudio Gonzalez, who's always dangerous on the Maryland circuit, then he's going to be a major force in this race, though kind of like the favorite Where She Told Me to Go, he's a little bit dependent on the pace, so we have to see how much speed develops up front, and I'm not sure how much there's going to be in this race. I mean, you've got the number 8 Arthur's Hope, who's always forwardly placed in these types of races, though I think 6 furlongs might be a little bit on the short side for him. I think a dangerous horse that's going to be forwardly placed throughout is the number 2 Press My Bets for Scott Lake. He's getting a real class test in this race, and he's just coming off an optional claiming victory last time out, but I thought he ran really well in the context of that March March race at Laurel. He was contesting a pretty quick pace going 7 furlongs, opened up a clear advantage at the top of the stretch. The closers came at him at the 8th pole, and he battled back pretty gamely to get the job done there by ahead, earning a career best 117 TimeformUS speed figure. That number does put him in the mix here, and I think he's going to appreciate the cutback to 6 furlongs. I'm not sure that he's quite up to the quality of some of the horses in this race because he is moving way up in class here, but he's a 5-year-old who seems to be in the best form of his career right now, and I would anticipate that Carol Cedeno is going to give him an aggressive ride from the inside, so don't be surprised if Press My Bets takes them a long way on the front end at a price in this race, though I would make my top pick the number 9 Eastern Bay and use Press My Bets as well as the favorite where she told me to go with that horse. The other race from Pimlico that I wanted to discuss on that Saturday card is race 10. It's the Federico Tessio going 1 1/8 on the main track for the 3-year-olds. In the past, this race has sometimes been thought of as an early prep for the Preakness, though I'll be somewhat surprised if any of the horses in this field land in that second jewel of the Triple Crown. Just doesn't seem like there's much graded stakes potential among this group, but it is a pretty well-matched competitive field, and for trip handicappers, you've got a lot of horses coming out of the same race, and that's often something that we like, having to watch just one replay and analyze how horses stack up against each other based on how they ran in a prior race together. The 5 horses coming out of that common race, being the private terms, are Accelerator, Royal Number, Zertz, Shackled Love, and May the Horse Be With You. The latter 2 names on that list, Shackled Love and May the Horse Be With You, are the 2 that battled it out to the wire for the victory that day, with Shackled Love just getting up over the favorite May the Horse Be With You, winning at 21-1. I thought that the private terms was not the most visually impressive race for anybody. May the Horse Be With You had a great trip for Brittany Russell as the even money favorite in that spot and just could never really get by Shackled Love, the long shot. It was kind of an ugly stretch drive. I know the fractions indicate that the horses came home in reasonable time and that the pace was fairly even throughout. To me, it looked like the entire field was struggling through the stretch as nobody was finishing up like they really wanted the mile in the 16th distance. I'm not going to be shocked if May the Horse Be With You is dangerous once again, but he's the 5-2 favorite on the morning line as these Brittany Russell horses just routinely take a lot of money on the Maryland circuit. And I wanted to go elsewhere in this race. I think there are some new faces, horses that are not coming out of that private terms that are more interesting than those that could take more money in this race. So I'm looking in a different direction. The horse that I think makes a lot of sense that's coming in from a different circuit is the number 4, the Reds, a horse that I'm quite familiar with, having competed mostly at Naira in his career. He's coming out of a Derby prep, having competed in the Grade 3 Gotham back in March, and he was no match for the top finishers in that race like Wayburn, Crowded Trade, and Highly Motivated, but it's not like he was totally disgraced running on for 5th there. He got a little rank on the backstretch that day. The pace was not that fast. It really moderated after the first furlong, and he kind of ran up on heels a little bit under Pablo Morales, who had trouble getting him to settle down in the opening furlongs. But then from there, the Reds was really wide coming around the far turn, never really threatened to be competitive in that race, but he was not that far off the top finishers, and he still earned a respectable speed figure, a 102 on the TimeformUS scale, which puts him right in line with those horses that are coming out of the local preps at Laurel. And furthermore, prior to that, the Reds had handled this 1 1/8 distance, something that really nobody else in this race can claim. He broke his maiden going this far at Aqueduct 2 back. That race didn't come up that fast. He actually improved his speed figure next time in the Gotham, even though he was off the board. But I thought the Reds was visually impressive, winning that maiden race 2 back. He was last in a 5-horse field in the early stages, quickly and easily moved past his rivals coming into the stretch and drew off like the distance is going to be no problem for him. So I just think the Reds makes a lot of sense in this race for John Kimball. And in some ways, to me, he's kind of the horse to beat, and he's 4-1 on the morning line. So that just makes him definitely the one that I would want to bet in this race. A horse that I'd want to use with him here, who's going to be a decent price, is the number 2, Tis Mandate. He's one of the more lightly raced horses in this field, just making his 5th career start. He's also stretching out around 2 turns for the first time, and I think he's going to like the added distance. The big concern with this horse is that he's just terrible getting out of the gate. He gets left at the start, he dwells, breaks slowly. That you could really see it last time in the Miracle Wood when he finished behind May the Horse Be With You, who was an easy winner that day, and Tis Mandate just walked out of the gate, spotting the rest of the field somewhere between 6 and 8 lengths, just the opening strides. You don't want to see that happen in a race at any distance. I think it's less of an issue going 1 1/8 around 2 turns when the field has some time to sort themselves out going into the first turn, and Tis Mandate hasn't always been that slow out of the gate, so I'm hoping he can break a bit more alertly this time. They're also adding blinkers for this start just to try to get him a little more involved in the races early, but as they've gradually stretched him out in distance, his performances have gotten a little better. I thought he ran pretty well last time to get within 4 lengths of May the Horse Be With You, even considering that deficit that he gave up at the start. So I just think he's moving in the right direction. He's 12-1 in the morning line. I'm not sure we're going to get that price on him, but he's very much the other horse that I want to use in this race. So I would key on the number 4, the Reds, and the number 2, Tis Mandate, giving preference to the Reds, who'll be a shorter price. He's the key for me, and I would play against horses like May the Horse Be With You, who's going to be overbet, and Shackled Love, who was the long shot winner last time, and it's going to be a much shorter price in this race coming off that perfect trip. So it's the new faces for me in the Federico Tessio. Moving over to a different venue, I want to talk about the first race of the day at Santa Anita on Saturday. The feature race there is the Santa Margarita graded stakes for the older fillies and mares. The Bob Baffert trained as time goes by. Looks like she's going to be pretty tough there as the heavy favorite on the morning line. But I want to talk about the first race of the day, the other stakes, which is the Crystal Water for the California breds, going a mile on the turf. The likely favorite here is going to be the number 1 North County Guy, and I really have no knocks against this horse other than the fact that he's going to be a pretty short price in this race. It just seems like trainer Richard Baltus has him in great form right now. He's won 3 of his last 4 races on the turf. His only loss was when they tried to stretch him out to 1.5 miles in the Grade 2 Hollywood Turf Cup. He doesn't want to go that far, and he was just overmatched in that race anyway. But his 2 starts since then have been pretty impressive. When he won the Turf Classic going 9 furlongs 2 back, and then last time when he won a high-level optional claiming race very easily. He got a perfect trip that day going the same 1 mile distance back in early March, but he won that race in hand. Mario Gutierrez really never even had to take the stick out on him. He just drew away from that field without ever being asked. And if he repeats either of those recent speed figures, a 115 or a 119 on the TimeformUS scale, he's going to be really tough in this race, and he's got the tactical speed to get the right kind of trip. So I think North County Guy, I'm not saying anything too clever, he's just a deserving favorite in here. I definitely prefer him to the other short price on the morning line, the number 2 Acclimate, who I have some questions about as he turns back to a mile. This is a horse that really does his best work at marathon distances, or what we consider marathon distances in the United States, 1.25 miles and beyond. And previously, when he's gone shorter in the past, he hasn't always been quick enough to make the early lead, and he is best when he gets to carve out the fractions on the front end. So I'm a little bit concerned about Acclimate perhaps not being best at the mile distance, but also not getting the right trip for him in this race. So I would take a stand against him if he is indeed the close second choice in this race. Though the horse that interests me most is one that's coming out of a different spot, actually stretching out in distance, and that's the number 3, Desmond Doss. If you follow that Horses to Watch segment that I do on DRFTV and DRF.com, this is a horse that I highlighted out of his last race in the Sensational Star, going 6 furlongs on the turf course at Santa Anita. That's a race that he probably should have won. He was defeated by today's rival Brando the Bartender that day, but whereas Brando the Bartender got a perfect trip from off the pace, closing into a pretty some competitive fractions, Desmond Doss was getting a good trip up until the quarter pole, at which point his rider Abel Cedillo decided to stick to the rail and try to squeeze through inside of the tiring frontrunner. It just didn't work out as the hole closed. This horse had to take up and steady, losing momentum inside of runners. He still had run coming past the 8th pole, but he was waiting for room, eventually got through on the rail just before the wire, and he almost got up for second, actually finishing pretty well at the end of that race, but the race was lost in upper stretch when he got steadied. And Desmond Doss, all things considered, regardless of distance or surface, just seems like he's continued to step forward since returning from a layoff for Steve Miotti this winter, and I liked his performance too back in the Tisnow on dirt. That was going a mile on the main track, and if he has the stamina to go a mile on the main track and nearly win a stakes race, it stands to reason that a mile on the turf should be no problem for him. And I think returning to turf last time in the Sensational Star, he showed that improvement that he had displayed on the turf really does translate to the turf, which I think might actually be his preferred surface. And furthermore, the TimeformUS pace projector indicates that he's quicker than Acclimate in the early going, and he might be able to take the lead here like they did in the Tisnow 2-bag on the dirt if his rider Abel Cedillo chooses to do so. So if Desmond Doss could control this race on the front end, and if he's able to get a clear trip this time, I think he's the main rival to North County Guy. Don't get me wrong, North County Guy is the most likely winner of this race, but Desmond Doss is the 4th choice on the morning line at 6-1, and I think that's value on him. So I'll primarily use these two and would advocate for Desmond Doss as the right win bet as a value play in this race. Next up is the Elusive Quality, Saturday's feature at Belmont Park, as we move on to the third venue on this TimeformUS forecast. And this is a pretty competitive field. You've got 8 runners signed on, a big long shot drawn to the outside, but you can say positive things about the other 7 runners in this race, though I would narrow down the main contenders to just 4 of these, and they're the 4 horses that I have at single digits on the morning line, and that group is led by one of 3 Chad Brown trained runners, the number 6 Front Run the Fed. This race is carded at 7 furlongs, and that seems like the ideal distance for Front Run the Fed. They tried the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint going 5.5 furlongs at Keeneland at the end of last year, and that made sense since he had run so well in a prep for that race at Kentucky Downs, just losing that lucrative turf sprint by a neck to the extremely talented turf sprinter Imprimis. Front Run the Fed, though, seems like 5.5 in that Breeders' Cup was just a little bit too short for him. He's really better going longer, these elongated turf sprints, and 7 furlongs, he's 2 for 2 at this distance at Belmont, so this just seems like the right kind of spot for him to kick off his 5-year-old campaign. He's not the kind of horse that has some massive speed figure edge over this field, so he doesn't have that much margin for error, but in a race where others are cutting back or stretching out, it seems like he's the one that's just a really logical fit here, so I expect him to get the right kind of trip, and I think he'll be tough. I didn't want to default to the favorite, though, so I think there are some others that you do want to take a look at. My top pick in this race would actually be the number 3, Casa Creed, who is one of those turnbacks as he goes out for Bill Mott. He was very competitive last time in the Grade 1 Kilroe Mile out at Santa Anita. Some of the best milers in the United States showed up in that race, and he only lost by a length and a half and was right in the mix until the 8th pole, at which point some others outkicked him to the wire. But Casa Creed, he's a horse that they've gotten pretty ambitious with over the past year. They've tried a number of Grade 1 races in addition to that Kilroe. He ran in the Breeders' Cup Mile last year. Before that, the Shadwell Turf, the 4-Star Dave, and aside from the Breeders' Cup, he really hasn't been disgraced in any of those races, and often going a mile, he gets there at the 8th pole and just can't always finish it off, and while I haven't ever tried a sprint with him against top company, I actually like him turning back to the 7 furlong distance. These Belmont Turf sprints going 7 furlongs, they typically play pretty fairly to horses that are turning back from a mile, and I think Casa Creed falls into that category, and is a horse that really could benefit from this trip. So I like him in this race from that perspective, and I also think he's going to work out a pretty good trip given the pace scenario, because you just got one speed in here, that being number 2, Proven Strategies for Barkassi. Personally, even though the pace projector indicates that he's going to have a big advantage up front, I just don't think Proven Strategies is good enough, and I think Casa Creed's going to get that perfect trip sitting right off that horse, and if he takes over an upper stretch, he's going to get the jump on some closers in this race, and he's got a decent finish on him, Casa Creed, so I think he might be able to take them from the quarter pole home and lead all the way down to the wire. So Casa Creed's my pick in this race, and if he stays at around that 3-1 morning line, I think that's a fair price on him. Though I'm certainly not against the other horse that's a similar price on the morning line, that being the number 4 Therapist for Christophe Clement. This horse actually won this race, the Elusive Quality, back in 2019 when he kicked off his 4-year-old season that day. He's a 6-year-old now, and you know, Therapist is a really versatile New York bred. He can run going as far as a mile and a 16th. He can be effective going as short as 6 furlongs on the turf, but 7 furlongs to a mile seems like it's really his best distance, and he's definitely pretty comfortable racing in these one-turn races at Belmont. He's 5 for 10 over this course at Belmont, so I like this as a starting point for him. I think if some others show up with their very best efforts, Therapist might not quite be good enough, because I think others might have a higher ceiling than he does against graded stakes company. This is not a graded stakes race, but it's drawn a graded stakes quality field. So I think Therapist will be in the mix at the end. I just couldn't quite go to him as my top pick in here, but he's definitely a horse that I would use in exotics. The one that's a difficult call for me is the number 1 Value Proposition, one of the other Chad Brown horses in this race. He has definitely shown ability in the past and looked like he was sitting on a really big year for the start of his 4-year-old season when he won that race off a layoff in June of 2020, going a mile over this Widener turf course. But after that, he was a bit of a disappointment in the poker, losing as the 5-2 favorite. I'll admit, while he was last in the Grade 1 Woodbine Mile, he did not get the right ride that day. For whatever reason, his rider, Luis Contreras, who's riding him for the first time, decided to put aggressively on the pace, and that's just not the running style that's going to work for Value Proposition. So I can draw a line through that Woodbine Mile, but value proposition for me is a horse that looked so good at the start of his career, and he's just never really fulfilled that potential. And he's also notoriously difficult to ride. He can get really rank on his riders. He has a tendency to lug in the stretch of his races. And Arad Ortiz, he's very familiar with this horse, but I'm just concerned about him getting the right trip in a crowded field from the rail, going 7 furlongs. And as you've seen for this opening week at Belmont Park, the Arad Ortiz runners just routinely get overbet. So this horse is 4-1 in the morning line. I think he would have been 6-1 if he had a different rider on him, but he could get bet down even below what I had pegged him at just because of who's riding him in this race. So I didn't want to rely on him, but I won't be surprised when he's effective here because he does have real ability. Let's finish things up on this Friday forecast with the feature race from opening day, or I should say opening night, on Saturday at Churchill Downs, the William Walker going 5.5 furlongs on the turf for the 3-year-olds. This is a pretty interesting field of 10 runners within the main body of the field, 2 on the also eligible list. As I said at the top of the show, there is some rain predicted for Churchill Downs on Saturday, so we'll see if this race does stay on the turf by the time they run it just after 10 p.m. I'll handicap it as if it's a turf race, though it does seem that there are some horses in this field who might be meant for dirt. One of those is from the Wesley Ward barn. He has 3 entrants, and I would say it's unlikely he runs all of them, knowing Wesley Ward's habits, but we'll talk about this race as if they're all entered for the turf. The one that's likely to be favored here is the number 8 Cowan. He's a horse that doesn't necessarily do a lot of winning. After he won his debut, he's actually lost 8 consecutive starts, but he has picked up many lucrative second-place finishes along the way. He's now earned over $660,000 in his career, and the runner-up finish that's most relevant to his chances in this William Walker was when he was second in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint at the end of last year behind the very talented Golden Pal. He got within 3/4 of a length of Golden Pal at Keeneland that day. Now, you could say Golden Pal was the superior horse because he set a pretty quick pace on the front end and was getting a little tired after he took a significant lead into the final 1/8 of a mile that day, and Cowan was basically doing his best running after the race was over. But still, Cowan has run some competitive speed figures on the turf in the past, even though he's only made 4 prior starts on the turf. The 3 that took place in this country were all solid stakes-placed efforts. He's coming off a couple of races over in the Middle East. He ran fine in the Saudi Derby 2 back. That was going a mile on the dirt. I think he's probably better going a little bit shorter on the grass, but they turned him back in Dubai last time against older horses in the Al Coast Sprint, and that was just too tough of a spot. He had not been earning the kind of speed figures or time form numbers to suggest that he was going to be competitive with some legitimate older turf sprinters, so it wasn't a real surprise that he wasn't competitive in that race. Now he's getting back into the right kind of spot, but I think you do have to wonder, has he really stepped forward off that form as a 2-year-old? I don't think we have a ton of evidence to say the answer is yes, but he might just be better than this field if he merely repeats those efforts from last year, though if he's going to be a pretty short price, and I do think he will be. He's 7-2 on the morning line, but I think he'll get bet down lower than that. I wanted to look at some other options, and there are definitely some others that you could make a case for at better prices. One of those is the number 3 Field Day, who's shipping in from Florida for the Brad Cox barn. This is a horse who's now made 5 of 6 career starts on the turf, all sprinting, and it seems like he just keeps getting a little better. He was beaten a couple of times by today's rival Looking for Loki earlier in the year at the fairgrounds, but it seemed like since they brought him to Gulfstream Park for his last 2 starts, he basically put things together. I thought he was a visually impressive winner at a short price 2 back in that optional claiming event. And then last year on the Texas Glitter, he's a horse who had shown a lot of speed in his starts leading up to that, but he got outrun to the front end by the eventual winner that day, Warrior's Pride, who just ran off on the front end, set some really crazy early fractions. And furthermore, Field Day had to steady a little bit when others were jostling for position to get into a stalking spot behind that runoff leader. So he had to steady back on the break for the far turn. All things considered, I thought he did pretty well to rally in the stretch, something that he had really never done before in his career. So I thought it was a game effort from this horse, and I prefer him to the horse who finished just ahead of him that day, Qasim, who finished a nose before him. Qasim got a really great pace setup for Mike Maker coming from the back of the pack, was really running when the race was over in that spot. So I think Field Day is the one that you want out of that Texas Glitter, though going out for the Brad Cox barn, I think it remains to be seen if he's much of a price either. He's likely to be the second choice in this race. A horse that I would want to make a case for if he gets into this race, and he might not because he needs 2 defections to do so, is the number 12 Charles Chrome, who's making his 3-year-old debut for trainer Reeve McGahey. I think this horse showed a lot of ability in his 2 turf starts at the end of last year at Indiana Downs. Two back, he was finishing second in a pretty live maiden race after debuting for a maiden $16,000 tag. They moved him right up into allowance company, and he ran a bang-up second that day, going 5 furlongs on the turf behind Beer Can Man, who came back to win and is fairly talented, and he's not the only one. There were some talented runners in that September allowance race from Indiana Grand. He came back next time in a similar spot, going the same 5 furlong distance, and was much more professional, was rated towards the back of the pack, made a sweeping move into contention off the far turn and won, going away over today's rival Looking for Loki, who I just mentioned was competitive with one of the major contenders in here, Field Day. So I think Charles Crome could really take a step forward to his 3-year-old debut if he's ready. Trainer Reeve McGahey has definitely had some success so far since taking out his trainer's license, and there does appear to be some pace in this race, so it could be the right setup for this closer. He just needs some defections to get into the race, and as I said, I think it's possible because you've got those 3 Wesley Ward runners. One of those, the number 1 Roderick, seems to have better dirt form, so you'd imagine maybe he's entered for if this race comes off the turf. Though if Charles Crome does not get into the race, I probably would default to Field Day as my top pick, and also use a horse like Next for Wesley Ward. I think he's got the best shot of those Wesley Ward runners moving back to the turf. Cowan, very logical. Don't think he's going to offer much value, but he is the other horse that I would use in this race. Though I would give preference to that horse on the also eligible list, Charles Crome, if he gets into this William Walker Turf Sprint. Well, that's it for the handicapping action on this week's TimeformUS Forecast. Definitely missed Craig today, but expect him to be back for that TimeformUS Pacecast when we record it on Tuesday. As I said at the beginning of the show, it'll be episode number 100 of the TimeformUS Pacecast, so look forward to that as we are likely to do our Kentucky Derby preview that day, talking about some of the contenders for the Derby, which will be run later next week on that first Saturday in May. So everybody remember, you can always listen to both of these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday.